Welcome to the Undefined Leader, where we reimagine leadership, redefine work, and get curious. Today, we're getting curious about leadership styles. I know it's something that I learned back in school. It's been a really long time for me since I've really digged into the different leadership styles. It also seems like every other year, there's a new style that's happening. So we have an expert, if you will, Professor Derek. He's not a professor. Maybe not an expert either, Derek, but you do have a master's in this, that you just finished your master's, and you dig deep pretty much into leadership styles there, right? So you're going to give us
Yeah,
all the juicy details.
for sure. I think in episode one, I finished, or I said it was a year of change. I finished a 2-year master's of science degree in leadership. And as part of that, we studied organizational leadership and kind of really dove into the different leadership theories and how that created different styles. And it's pretty fascinating. Alex, I was in the middle of it. You and I had a conversation about this. That was pretty good. So I'm excited about kind of revisiting that conversation with you.
Yeah, I helped you with your homework, I think. So if
Well,
Derek's
yeah.
professors are watching,
Yeah.
it was the teamwork. No, but I'm so excited, Derek, because prepping for this episode, I did not do any kind of research at all. So all the information I know about this comes from back when I first learned it. And the reason I didn't prep for this too is because I want to give my honest reactions to everything that you're saying today. And I'm just really excited for you to kind of walk us through, why is leadership styles and knowing our leadership style even important? And how did it all begin? Like, how do we
Yeah.
even have the first leadership style?
I think it's good to have context and kind of like the history. And also, I think our plan here is to do a two-parter, the first ever two-part, where for this one, we will focus more on kind of moving through an evolution or a chronological timeline of how the different theories sprung up, how that led to the different styles, how they evolved. And then I think what plan for part two is to talk a little bit more about why that's relevant and how to use that and how to lead and, you know, work with people with different styles. But should we get started on this from
Let's
the
do it
beginning?
from the very beginning.
What's really interesting about this is if you go back to the beginning of leadership theory and leadership styles, it's not that long ago, 100 and 120-ish years ago. Yeah. And so like the actual science and study of leadership is a very modern thing. And I think that's actually why it does seem like it changes so much, because we're still trying to figure it out. It's still being studied, and like, it's not like mathematics that have been studied, for like thousands of years. It's a really, really new thing. And so really like the first leadership theory was like around the 1840s, 1850s that came out. And you'll love the name of it.
What is
The
it?
first one is the great man theory.
Really? I have never heard that leadership style before.
Yeah. So if you think about what's happening in the mid 1800s, like why all of a sudden would this be important? It's basically, a lot of the world went into the industrial revolution. And so now leaders are existing now in kind of like for the first time in like a management role. So basically prior to that, if you were a leader, you were basically like a military leader, or you were a king, or you were, that's kind of it. Like maybe like a religious leader, like a pope or a bishop or something like that. But
Like a tribe.
outside of that, there wasn't really a need for this idea of leadership until now. You've got factories and you've got this need for efficiency and productivity that just didn't really exist before. And so this idea behind the great man theory is that leaders are born. They are born with heroic qualities. Uh, they are male. Women don't fall into this. Women can't be born with the hero qualities or the leader qualities, and that is basically why we get figures like George Washington and Napoleon and Abraham Lincoln. Is that they are just born being great leaders, like completely prepared for leading through, the situation that they're in. And because of that, you can't learn leadership. You can't teach someone to be a leader. Um, there's really nothing you can do. You either have it or you don't.
Hmm. That's interesting. I mean, the first two things that I think of is leadership existed anytime humans existed. I mean, think of back in, like, even when we're in the caves and stuff, didn't people in a tribe or caves pick a leader among themselves? So it's interesting that that probably always existed, but we never put any kind of education around it, and we weren't curious about it until until the Industrial Revolution. And
Yeah,
even
well, you
kings, like, did we not ever question which king is more efficient and productive and which king is the way they're communicating with their people?
Yeah, well, it's, in that example that you're using there, like the tribe picking someone, like what logic system would they use to pick that person? Someone probably born
Strong.
with certain genetics, like they're bigger than everyone else, or they're taller than everyone else. Like even with George Washington, it's like as a kid, here in school, you learn about him, and it's like when he was a kid, like he couldn't tell a lie. He was just born with this like innate integrity and honesty, and he happened to be really tall too. But it's all things like outside of their ability to learn or develop. So there's no such thing as like leadership development. And this is even where for like, you mentioned kings and like the monarchy, this is kind of that idea too of like hereditary. But you're born with whatever it is inside of you that makes you worthy to rule and to lead. And so I think it was in 1840 when this theory was kind of like formalized to try to explain leadership and who are the leaders and like how leaders are. Right? So they're just born with it. It's just inside of them. It's in their DNA. You're going to say something?
Yeah. The other thing I'm really excited to keep hearing about is how that thought changes, because I know leaders today that still think you're either born with leadership skills or you're not. So I'm really curious to see, even though this was back in the 1840s, you said, how people even today still believe in that and what education has changed about it. So
Yeah.
keep going. I'm
Actually,
excited.
it hasn't been long enough of a study for things to be like really, really outdated. And so that's what you'll still find. Different things like this are still kind of running around inside of education and philosophies and way of thinking. So, the huge problem though I mean, there's many problems with the great man. There's many problems. But from a scientific standpoint, is okay. Let's say you're studying this as leadership. I mean, how do you compare Napoleon to Abraham Lincoln? But there's really like nothing you can necessarily identify. Is it their integrity? Is it their patience? Is it their, whatever it is? There's nothing you can really like lock in, because you could take Abraham Lincoln and move him into a different country or a different context. And that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be a great leader. It had to do a little bit more like with opportunity. And so they sort of realized, this doesn't really serve us well if so you can't learn it, you can't develop, and there's nothing we can kind of like pinpoint to. So then that kind of gave rise then to like the early 90s to the next theory, which is the trait theory. So now the trait theory is it's the personality. It's the personality traits. So things like intelligence, confidence, charisma, integrity. This was kind of like right along with too, I think this is important context until the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was really no such thing as psychology or the study of psychology. So this kind of overlapped with now people are studying psychology of personality traits. So a lot of the early psychology is around personality traits as well. So it's kind of borderline too with things you're born with. Like it hadn't really fully moved away from that because a lot of your personality, the things that you're born with. But at least now you could maybe look at a leader and say, hey, these are good traits to have and try to copy that as well. So there is this sort of idea that leadership study now is basically just like mimicking other leaders or copying other leaders. Alex, can you kind of guess the problem with just kind of straight up copy another leader?
Absolutely. First one being, you're also now saying you're born with these personality traits that you may not be able to develop and grow in those areas. So you're either a leader or you're not. Second one being, I think it's very unauthentic. So you're just pretending to be somebody else that you know was successful, pretending that, and we're just assuming that that other leader that had those traits was successful. So you're just copying that instead of innovating your own leadership style and using your own strengths.
And see, again, this is like the science of leadership that we're talking about. They're studying this. Psychologists are studying this with the rise of psychology, and they can't actually pinpoint what are the traits. Because this effective leader over here has these traits. This effective leader over here might have completely different traits, but they're both effective, good leaders. So which is it? This is like when you dive into it and actually like read all this type of stuff, there's just this argument. It's these traits, and they can never actually identify what the personality traits are, make a good leader. And so, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. So when you're saying they were comparing these different leaders that were good, what were the measurements at that point if they were still trying to figure out the traits? How are they comparing a leader that's good versus bad, and how are they thinking that that person's good, and so we're just going to copy this leader again?
That's part of the problem. They couldn't really take the experiment. What is it that we're measuring? How do you measure charisma? How do you measure intelligence? How do you measure confidence? And someone super confident, super intelligent with those personality traits, that doesn't mean they're going to be a good leader. And that's just, it was very short lived. This was straight through there in the 90s, just because there was no way to replicate it, or there was no way to reach any type of consensus. So like the great man theory, the trait theory, fairly similar, but moving away from the idea of, okay, you're not just born a leader or not. There are certain traits that go into it. And then kind of the next evolution happens, which when we start to get into more modern approaches. And this is basically kind of like for the US in the interwar period between World War I and World War II. And specifically, there was a scientist, his name was Kurt Lewin, for those who want me to cite my sources. Kurt Lewin, and he basically creates this idea that it's definitely not things that you're born with, because a lot of leaders were born into that position and they're terrible at it. It's not personality traits, it's behaviors. So then we move into the behavior theory, which kind of occupied the next couple of decades. And this is where the original leadership styles come from. Now, finally, is in the behavior theory of leadership. And there's three main ones that kind of still influence everything that Lewin came up with. He said, leaders basically have three camps of behaviors. There's the autocratic, there's the democratic, and there's the laissez-faire. The autocratic, their behaviors are, they want to make all the decisions. They want to have a high level of control. They want a very vertical hierarchy. They sit at the top. Decisions, come down from on top. Autocratic. The democratic wants it to be a little more horizontal, wants to be collaborative, wants it to be participatory. Then the laissez-faire style of behavior is minimal. The leader wants minimal guidance. They basically want their team members to have as much autonomy as possible. I think it's really important as we're going through these, when you're kind of doing this from a scientific discussion, there's really not right or wrong. There's just more effective and less effective. And as the autocratic, democratic, laissez-faire, none of them can actually kind of study this. And they do find that the democratic tends to be a little bit more effective in things. The autocratic can also be effective. It depends on the context. Like if we're talking about like military and safety and things like that, there's actually a lot of value in having a pretty autocratic leader. And typically the least effective is like the laissez-faire. But Alex, from what you remember from school and your study, do you remember those, the autocratic, the democratic, and the laissez-faire?
I do. Yeah, and I kind of remember it as like the laissez-faire. The one that I remember it the most at is like delegating. It was, you're able to just delegate. And then democratic, of course, is we create the vision together. We create the task and the strategy together, versus the autocratic is more top-down approach, very hierarchical, very, I know the vision, you're going to follow me, and here's how we're doing it. Is that correct? Like what I remember? Yeah.
Yeah, that's completely correct. It's still like these three are kind of still used. Now, the other leadership styles are kind of downstream from these different kind of categories. The main problem during this behavior of why they moved on to the next era was it doesn't really speak to the followers of the leader at all. It's not cornering leadership as completely on the leader. And that's just not a modern understanding of leadership. Like a modern understanding of leadership is the effect that you have on others, not necessarily specifically your traits or the behaviors that you do. It's the effect that you have. And kind of an outdated thinking that comes from this era as well, from the behavior, is that you didn't change. You were only one. You were either always autocratic, you were either always democratic, you were always laissez-faire. And that's not necessarily true either in things. And there are now like more universities and things are studying things. And what they're doing now is comparing the people involved actually, you know, which, what makes a good leader? Is it a leader that focuses on production and efficiency? Or is it a leader that focuses on the relationship with their followers? And now this is kind of like where kind of the camps are dividing and where the studying is heading into as well. This is also one thing about the era of the inner war. Here in history, this is actually now when we're starting to see like unions form up, and we're starting to get things like employee rights, and we're getting like the 40-hour work week, and we're getting like pensions, and we're getting Monday through Friday, and we're getting days off. And so like you kind of have like that going on as well, that's influencing of, maybe if the employees want to burn the factory down, that's not great leadership that's going on in that factory. If they're just solely focused on production only and not taking into account other people that are following them feel about it.
That makes a lot of sense. One thing I think a lot of people keep thinking about when you think of leadership styles, that you are one leadership style. Your identity is one leadership style. And I'm curious your thoughts on this. I don't think that's accurate. And I think it's based off of the situation. And one person could be wearing multiple different types of leadership styles that you bring up to different situations. Like, for example, I was thinking of the autocratic one. I could see that being really successful in a crisis situation. When the company is in a crisis, things are going bad, you may not want to come up and say, hey guys, I have no idea what's going on, what's going to happen, let's figure it out, which that could be in a different situation, could be helpful as well. But you do sometimes want a leader that comes in that says, hey guys, here's how we're going to solve the problem, that you trust them and you can go and solve a problem quick. Do you agree with that you can have one person that's wearing a lot of different things and could be more effective on different situations?
Not only do I agree with that, but that was the big push during this time period of people are individuals. One style for leading a whole team or leading a whole company, it just can't make sense, because we as individuals, we respond to different styles. And so that's when, again, the shift started to happen to, it is situational. It is individual. And that kind of opened the way now to what they call the contingency theory. So now we move from the behavior era, the behavior theory, to the contingency theory. Now we're getting into like the 60s. Behavior theory stuck around for multiple decades. It had a lot of the basis for current thinking. And there's something really interesting that happened in the late 50s, late 60s. There was a guy named Douglas McGregor, and he was like, what really impacts leadership is how you as a leader view your followers and how you view your employees. Like, that's going to affect how you show up as a leader. And that's when he basically came up with, there's two ways that leaders view their employees and their followers. There's theory X and there's theory Y. And theory X is the assumption that people working need to be micromanaged. They need strict supervision. They need head and stick. They need constant oversight because they're going to be lazy. They're going to cut corners. They're basically not going to work unless you're very hands-on and very involved. That's the theory X, leadership. And then the theory Y is kind of the opposite, that people are self-motivated. They inherently don't have a problem with work when the work was full and meaningful, and they want to have self-responsibility. They don't want to micromanage, that they'll actually be more productive if you just trust them to do things. And the whole idea behind this was, he studied this for a while and he couldn't prove that either was true. He kept coming back to, it seems like either one could be true. It just depends on whatever the leader believes. So if the leader believes theory X, they believe that people are lazy, you have to stay on top of them, will be your experience as a leader. And that's going to shape your leadership style. That is ultimately going to determine your leadership style that you adopt. If you're theory Y and you believe that people are self-motivated, They like to work again when the work is meaningful, fulfill, be responsible. That is going to shape your own theory of leadership and your leadership style.
You said this was in the
Yeah, kind of late 50s, early 60s.
Theory X makes me think of all the news articles that were out in the 60s, 70s, even that were titled, "Nobody wants to work anymore. It's so hard to find good employees. People are lazy." Like this was actually in articles in the newspaper. That's how much people believed in it. And I can see how that probably evolved into micromanagement.
Because two very powerful leadership thoughts and styles came out of this on that X and on that Y type of thing. And when I get last to that is, okay, so a lot of leadership is your assumptions you have about people. It's going to shape who you are. And also too, it does seem to, if an employee, let's say we have a Theory X leader, but there's an employee who shows up self-motivated, all of these things, like that employee might get a different leadership style than the rest. So now it is contingency. There is a lot of situational leadership that comes into play. And now, as we get into like the late 60s, this is where everything is going. It's going now to leadership as a skill of your ability to kind of adapt to your situation and have the right approach to that unique individual and the situation that's going on. And another scientist, Robert House, creates what he calls path goal theory. What is leadership? In a sense, what is leadership? When his idea is, okay, leadership is you create a goal and then you lay out a path for the employee to achieve that goal. And you as the leader, it's your job to remove all the obstacles. And so now it's about motivation. It's about clarity, like clarifying the path, because now if you think about what's going on at the same time, we're now starting to have the beginning of the rise of corporations and bigger companies that we didn't really have before. So now we're kind of starting to experience like the CEO as figurehead. And what is the purpose of the CEO? It's to have like a big grand vision and really motivate everyone of like, this is where we want to go. And we even saw that with like presidential stuff at the time too, of like JFK, we're going to go to the moon. This is right in that era. Like JFK is following the current leaderships, whoever is writing his speeches are tapping into the current leadership style and thinking of, hey, you know what? They're in the 1960s. It's just, if you want to be a big leader, you need to get up and give some huge goal, then lay out the path. It's path goal theory. Yeah, it's straight from the White House. Now, what we're kind of expecting the leader to be. How do you feel about this goal?
I get shivers from just past experiences a little bit, but it makes me think of like selling the dream. Like the leader's job at that moment was to sell the dream of we are going to go to the moon or we are going to go to this goal. And so you're almost it's not a mutually set upon goal. You're giving the goal to your employees. And then your job is to like push and motivate people to actually get to that goal no matter what. But I can see it being a very easy formula to see what leadership is what was your goal? Did you achieve your goal? Did you not achieve your goal? Okay, well, now that's what success looks like.
Yeah. And you're so right. And we're starting to get, this is starting to feel like more modern. This is stuff that we live, right? We see this kind of playing out. Classical theory was huge. But then what it created, I kind of mentioned out too, there's two schools of thoughts that are massive leadership styles. Two of the absolute most important leadership styles, transactional versus transformational. Because, okay, we have a goal. We recognize that leadership now is making the goal, creating the path, removing obstacles. However, do you actually motivate people go down this path and get there? And so now the first theory that came out of it was transactional leadership. Everything's a transaction.
Give, take. If you do this, I'm going to pay you more. If you do this, you'll have better benefits. If you do this, you can climb the ladder.
Yeah, exactly. What's in it? What's in it for me? What's in it for you? Everything is a transaction. It's kind of cold. I think it maybe removes a lot of the bigger purpose or meaning out of work and things like that. If everything can just kind of be boiled down to a transaction, we're kind of now in the 70s, getting into the early 80s when this is really being talked about and studied. I think even though this was like 50 years ago at this point, I think this describes a lot of leaders, like modern leaders, do things through a transactional lens. Just think of how, especially in the West and like in the US, of compensation, how compensation plans, structured bonuses, splits, overtime. It's all about I don't want to say bribes, on things, but it's like if I really want to motivate you,
Carrot,
Alex, we've
dangling the
got this
carrot.
thing. Yeah, it is. That's even kind of when you dive into the study of breaking down transactional. Yeah, exactly like that. It's contingency reward, the type of theory. And even part of the transaction might be, and if you don't, you're fired. So it's not just the carrot, it's the fear also, or it's the it's promotion. Hey, keep working more hours, keep being all in, and you're going to rise the ranks. That can be transactional in nature as well. And I don't want to, especially in this episode, I don't want to get caught up in like right versus wrong or bad versus good. We just want to be more academic in this one, and effectiveness, which can be very effective. If you think about like sales teams, startups, different things like that, like there is something to it. There is definitely a reason why it is probably the most widely used leadership style. Even people that are all sorts of other leadership styles can still be transactional ultimately when it comes down to it. So it's huge, the impact that this theory has had. But it created, as a pushback, it created another style, the transformational style. So transactional kind of came first as a way to kind of explain everything. And then some people are like, no, that's not always the case. For one, not everyone is motivated by money or more money or the carrots or the fear. And not every leader actually leads that way. And so the kind of the pushback theory was some leaders are transformational. So this is all under possible theory. This is under the same idea of the leader creates a vision, creates a goal, and then tries to find a way to get the people to that goal. The idea behind transformational is the leader, instead of bribing or things like that, they inspire you to want to do it. Typically, remember kind of like the earlier styles too, and the earlier behaviors, they typically have charisma. There's another component of transformational that they call intellectual stimulation, where it's like, oh, they are so smart. Like some of the examples of transformational leaders are people like Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, leaders that kind of like, that they weren't involved in like employee pay. So that was like way below of them. And in essence too, like if you wanted to go work for one of those leaders, you were probably actually not making very good money. You were working horrible hours. You were not getting all the good benefits. That's not how they were going to reward you. It was more of like, Alex, come join us here at Google or at Microsoft. We're going to be a part of something that changes the world, that changes history. And the idea is, does that inspire you to want to achieve what they're trying to achieve, where you're going to work crazy, 80, 100-hour weeks, or maybe even terrible pay, but you're just so inspired by mission. Does that kind of make sense on that transformational side?
Yeah, I have a question. Do you think Theory X evolved into transactional and Theory Y kind of evolved into transformational, where Theory X again was, I don't believe that people, are coming to work inspired, they're lazy, all this stuff, then that would be, okay, well, how am I going to support people that are lazy? Okay, well, I'm going to dangle a carrot in front of them. Versus transformational. Do you think that has a correlation?
I do. I do think that's where just they were with the study on it. And again, I think a lot of times, like if you're going to be a transactional leader or a transformational, I do think it comes down to how you feel about people. Like, do you feel like you do have to like do the bribes and, and all those other things in order for things to get accomplished? Or do you feel like, man, if we just have a really cool thing that we're doing, people are going to want to work here. They're going to want to work and do this, even if we have to pay. It's not that competitive. That's not why we're doing it.
They'll be inspired anyway. Yeah, that makes sense.
Cons, well, there's pros and cons. The pros, it's talking about the pros of transactional leadership. There tends to be a lot of clarity. Do X, get Y. Don't do this, end up with this. Like there does tend to be a lot of clarity in that. It's efficient. It can kind of be fair. in some ways, if everyone kind of has the same metrics. It's really good for routine, doing things over and over. Yeah. For you, outside, I know a lot about you and just kind of your style and everything. For you, with the transaction, for you in your mind, what do you think are like the cons to people, right? Of your people, if it's a very transactional heavy environment or transactional heavy leadership style.
I think you take the focus on people away more. So even if we had a relationship, now it's just the give and take relationship. And because of that, I think cons happen. Like people may not be as inspired. They might be motivated by the wrong things. Like Wells Fargo is a really big one where they thought they were doing a good job and they incentivized all their people on the more accounts you create, the more money you make. What happened? It became an extremely unethical situation where all these people that were ethical were now incentivized to create new accounts. So now they were creating accounts, even though if it wasn't for the benefit of the customer, for example. So a lot of those times being very clear on what the measurables of is that are to win, I think could determine how successful, how beneficial, how ethical behaviors create as well.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. And with all those things too, in that heavy transactional side, it does tend to stifle creativity, innovation. There's something really interesting too that I think is a con here that I think gets overlooked, but I think it makes the bar to be a leader kind of low. That's essentially like if you can just throw money at people to get them to do things, are you really leading? So like the skills needed in this environment are low. It's easy to be a transactional leader, especially in again, when you have like that reward or, just fear. If you're able to wield a lot of fear, it's easier than to be a leader. Like do this or you get fired. Do this or you get written up. So it kind of, I think, removes that, that skill set, of the other things of that leader, and they can kind of fall back on it a little bit. And it's power. That's ultimately what I'm trying to say. Like it kind of is a power type of leading. The pros of transformational, it drives innovation, it drives engagement, it can drive morale. Cons, it can really like burn you out also, right? Because there's going to be a lot demanded of you in that. And upon the kind of parallels with the transactional is it's really, really hard to be a transformational leader. You've got to have really good communication skills. You've got to have really good people skills to be able to get up and address the people. And JFK was a phenomenal communicator. You can point to him as that transformational leader. And a lot of these, like, think about like your prototypical CEO, and that is actually the skill set. It's their ability to communicate. And if you lack those skills, it's going to be, you might want to be transformational and you want to inspire, but you lack the ability to do that. And so that is a con. It's really hard to be a transformational leader. It's rare. What's the debate? Transactional and transformational. I think a lot of people say that they're transformational, but they're really transactional. It's definitely a problem. So we're kind of getting to where we're at now. Now a third pushback style happens to these two, because the pushback is, well, okay, we get it, transactional versus transformational, but those lack ethics, those lack morality, those lack ethics. They're very like kind of cut and dry. And this is where servant leadership comes from. And so servant leadership is like its own distinct style and school of thought. It was actually Robert Greenleaf in kind of the late 70s after this whole transactional and transformational thing. And he was basically like, no, those are cold, those are unethical. Right. Transactional also kind of led a little bit to like the layoffs of like the 80s and a lot of kind of like the corporate stuff, because again, it's just a transaction. And he's like, no, it needs to be, we need to put, a higher sense of morality and ethics into leadership. And so the servant leadership style, where the priority of the leader is to serve and develop the people around them, not exercise authority. Transactional and transformational are both authority driven. So again, it's this empathy, stewardship, personal development of those around you, how to break the typical hierarchy, again, of like the original autocratic one that we were talking about. And the leader just exists to serve everyone around them.
So
What do you
there's
think
this
about that?
switch in mindset now of it's not about the leader as much, it's about the people that they're leading as
Mm-hmm.
well. I was also just thinking back to transactional and transformational. I think to this day, a lot of businesses are transactional. I think how we are used to working as a society is very transactional, even if there are servant leaders, transformational leaders, and some of these newer leadership styles you're going to talk about. I'm curious, and maybe in part two, we could talk about this. I'm curious of how can you get a leader that may not be transactional, but has to operate in a very transactional society and business, and what that does to their leadership style.
I think this is why it's tough and there's a lot of overlap because yeah, you might not agree with the transactional thing or not like that, but you are in a system that operates that way. Trying to break out of that. That's where transformational, true transformational leadership, I think is just so rare. Where that leader kind of almost in some ways becomes a bit of like a cult like of sorts. And with servant leadership, the pros are trust, morale, empathy, all of those things that maybe just being transactional lacks. The cons with servant leadership are, again, it's just really, really hard. And it's really, really hard not to be hypocritical in this one, I think, because what happens when a crisis happens? Are you still going to maintain your servant leadership, or are you going to take power, take control, make the decisions, right the ship, get things back on track? It's so that, in my opinion, that's not a true servant leadership style. It's maybe a desire to be more laissez-faire in a way, or kind of get out of the way. But again, I think it's tough to actually maintain a true, consistent servant leadership style. Similar thought, like could we point to any examples of real servant leaders? And usually the examples that come back are like Mother Teresa or Gandhi, where they never exercised real power. They never really made decisions. Like a lot of the examples actually go to like nonprofits and mission oriented work where it actually kind of makes sense for that figurehead to not actually be like the power person. Where again, the active leadership is to serve the organization. It's really, really difficult to actually see in the business world. I think there could be a lot of positivity and like striving for it, but it's really actually hard to actually see it like play out for real, where someone is a true servant leader. It's tough.
This right here is what I've been waiting for the entire episode, because every article I read about servant leadership makes it like it is the ultimate leadership that you could possibly be. And I haven't read a single article, that doesn't mean that it's not out there, that described the cons of what a servant leader should look like too. So do you think, like the examples you gave, it seemed like they were all very nonprofit businesses versus profit businesses? Like, is that the difference? Can we even find a true servant leader in a profit making business?
Well, I'm sure some exist, but it's like the examples are very hard to come up with us. Because again, when when there's a crisis, when there's an issue, when there's a challenge, this kind of gets into that situational thing. Like a lot of times, I don't think we even want the leader in those moments to be a servant leader. We want someone to step up
Make a
and
decision and
make the decision, and that is not servant leadership. So that's why it's tough. That's why it's a really, really hard one. It's still considered like a modern leadership. I've seen some articles and stuff of like what are the leadership styles that work best with Gen Z, and you will always see servant leadership. And I think it's this idea of it's collaborative, it's empowering, it's all these type of things, which it can be, but there's just a very high risk and a high level of danger with this one. I think like for a leader that wants to be a servant leader, they need to be very careful because then like, well, it's tough to be that servant leader, but to be like the highest paid person or it's, to be like the final vote or the decision maker on things that's kind of not what it means to be a servant. It means you're going to elevate everyone else above you. So, again, like Mother Teresa, she was like the lowest paid employee in that whole organization. Or pick other organizations like that, or other like charities and stuff like that, where you'll see like maybe someone who kind of already has means of wealth and stuff like that. They'll move into this role in like a pro bono type of position to be a servant leader for the organization. Even like the transactional aspect of it and money, but the true idea of like being a servant leader.
Well, the only con I was able to come up with was, and I like yours, that's the transactional side of it, but the definition is to put others in front of yourself, right? But then isn't every relationship, which I think leadership and the people that you're leading is a relationship, aren't you supposed to put yourself first, then the other person, and you have to love yourself first in order to love someone else more? When you put your face mask on, the analogy people give first is, the parents should put it on before their kids and all that stuff. So then leaders could burn out way more. You're not showing up as your best self, which then how can you truly serve your team when you're not your best self at the same time?
I agree. What was kind of missing again in the 60s, 70s with transactional versus transformational was this idea of ethics. So now we're trying to add ethics into that with the servant leadership. And a lot of it, like for Yaks, it's going to come down to your personal ethic too, of like, that is a personal ethic of like, help yourself be able to help others. It's for the company to make money to be able to help more people. That is an ethic. Versus someone else might have a differing ethic of complete self-sacrifice, at the expense of everyone else around them. And that is their personal ethic. So even the definition of what you think it means to serve others could vary as well. That is also part of the challenge of this. From the research though, there is definitely a lot of positive effects on the workplace when the leader is trying to be a servant leader to the best of their ability. When they are trying to model, better than anyone else here, we're all kind of like, there's no one more special than others. Those are also kind of like the ethics of servant leadership. There does seem to be a positive effect on the organization. Right. So if we want to kind of wrap this up, so there's just one final era, and it's basically the modern from like 2000 and forward. And it's basically the emotional intelligence era. That what those other ones lack was now emotional intelligence. And so Daniel Goleman for like Harvard, I think it was in like 2000, he basically created the 6 modern leadership styles: coercive, authoritative, affiliative, democratic, pace setting, and coaching. These all have pros and cons. We all have faces back. It's kind of like the 3 original, but then we added, uh, you know, uh, goals to it. We added motivations to it. We added employee relations to it. We added ethics to it. Now we're adding emotional intelligence to it. And the idea is that, Alex, if you want to be the best leader that you can be, you're going to master all the styles. You're going to have your natural style, your instinctive style, which you're going to be naturally good at. But there's going to be time periods where a different style is required. And if you don't have the ability to situationally shift to that other style, you're lacking in your leadership ability. Different situations call for different things. Even the skill of the person that you're working with, like as they develop in their skill, you could be able to change the way, from this is more like things like selling versus directing versus selling versus delegating, and kind of understanding where somebody is and move through. And I don't think it makes a lot of sense to go through each of those individually. Like people can kind of look those up. But a lot of times the word kind of speaks for itself, a little bit of the leadership style. And those are the modern ones that are out there. Now, kind of from those, we're starting to get into things like the authentic leadership style, or the coaching leadership style wasn't that original stick, but I think that's kind of a trendy one as well. But they're basically now kind of offshoots from those 6 that Daniel Goleman came up with in 2000. And I'm sure we're on the verge of more leadership theories and more more leadership styles. But do you kind of notice any trends or themes maybe that we're kind of working towards maybe this leadership style, or where this is kind of continuing to evolve or go towards?
Yeah, I think it's always going to evolve. Hence the name of our podcast, the Undefined Leader, because it's hard to define. It's always something that you're looking at. What are the new social needs? What are the economic needs? What's happening in the world? How is that affecting people? And then what kind of leaders are going to be able to support those needs the best? I really like the examples you gave of what was happening in the world during that time of like world wars, and how did that affect leadership? And I think we're on the verge, to your point, of figuring out what is the next type of leadership style that's happening. Gen Z's coming in and their needs are very different than, for example, what a boomer's needs might be. So I think the next few episodes, what we're going to do is we're going to try to discover what are the needs of employees going into the future, try to predict those, and then really try to define the undefined leader of what are the skills and traits that we think future leadership styles should have. And Derek, I am so excited that we finally did this and this little mini lecture. In part 2, I want to find out about what your leadership style is, what my leadership style is. Let's help our audience figure out what their leadership style is as well. And then maybe we can dive in a little bit of pros and cons and the different situations of when you can use them, how you can develop, and the importance of knowing what your cons might be with that leadership style and how to grow from that too.
Sounds good. I'm looking forward to it. Join us for part 2.
Join us for part 2.